Welcome to the latest in our series of Arts Talks. I'm Stephen Barker, the Dean of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts. We're following up on our conversation with Kevin Appel, the chair of the art department, talking to one of our third-year graduate students in the art department, Ivy Guild, who has done a number of things during her time here. And I'm delighted, Ivy, that you're joining us this morning. I'm really eager to talk with you about some of the really wonderful things you've done during your period of time here at UCI. So first of all, let me just ask you to introduce yourself. Where are you from? What your main interests are?
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for having me to talk to you. So yes, my name is Ivy Guild, and I'm a third-year M.F.A. art student here at CTSA. And I have a lot of different aspects of my practice. I came about this, like you said, from the University of San Diego, where I actually started in a biology major. I was going to be a marine biologist. I had an aunt and uncle who live in the Florida Keys, and they had me all inspired to work with the ocean. And I still love science, but I realized at University of San Diego that when I wasn't doing my lab homework, I was making art. So after just one semester in science, I switched over to the visual arts major and later decided to double major in art history, mainly looking at public art interventions. So a lot of this has carried through to, where I am today at UCI. I am still very interested in science and the ways that it can overlap in art. My practice is installation and bio art based, meaning I tend to make living installations and sculptures with my work. And now I have a new love for teaching that UCI has brought me as well. So I guess that's a SparkNotes version of who I am.
Well, it's a wonderful trajectory on your way here. I know that between your time in San Diego and your time here at UCI, there's a gap. Were you producing art during that time? What were you doing then?
I was, I was lucky enough to live in a space where suddenly my garage could become a art studio, and I tended to do several jobs. So I was working 9 to 5, doing several part-time jobs in the art world, and then going home and trying to make work, for the first time outside of undergrad, which was really tough at first. It's a learning curve that I try to tell my students about. You have to set your own deadlines and schedule to make work, but I found myself showing in different parts of San Diego County, San Diego Art Institute, the William D. Cannon Gallery in Carlsbad, and a few others. But I started out teaching at the new Children's Museum, actually, in downtown San Diego. I was a teaching artist there, really enjoyed that space. It's a remarkable museum. I recommend it. But from there, I shifted gears a bit, and I went to being a curatorial assistant at Lux Art Institute, drawing a bit more on my art history major and that experience. And after that, I went back to my home department at USD, and they hired me to be the special projects coordinator. So I put on a lot of events for our undergrads there. Pechakuchas and other fun art events like open studios, a lot of which has, been something I've been able to do here at UCI as well. I decided that I wanted to take my practice further though. So that's when I decided to really double down on that late night studio practice and apply to grad school. I thought that UCI was the perfect pick for me. It's very interdisciplinary. I wanted to go to a program that would support me and the, 5 or so different mediums that I choose to work in. And I wanted to go to a research institution where I would be able to overlap with the sciences if I wanted to, which has been really beneficial to me here so far. So that's kind of the gap that brought me here to UCI.
Right. It's a fairly amazing trajectory. It's not uncommon for I will just flatter you a little correctly and say our top graduate students who already, like you, have really quite a solid career going and then decide that there's something more to be done, that brings them back to school. It's something I myself did long after leaving my undergraduate years. Turns out to be fairly seductive. It's something that you probably will never get out of, but then that's not such a bad thing. So the interdisciplinary quality of the art department here is something that you were very interested in. Tell me something more about the people you've worked with in the art department and across the campus in your continued connection to the sciences.
Yes, absolutely. So I was lucky to meet Antoinette from our department, Antoinette Lafarge, when I got here. And she is heavily invested with Jesse Jackson in art and design and art and technology. And they immediately drew me into kind of their section of the department and the kind of classes that we have that really blend those interdisciplinary qualities that art lends itself to. I work with Jesse Jackson in his speculative prototyping lab, where we have different 3D printing systems set up. This year for my thesis, I am experimenting with making a living 3D printing filament, or if not, if that doesn't come to fruition, living out of the machine, I'm planning on experimenting with mycelium, which is part of the fungal structure of a mushroom, mycelium-based 3D printing filament that could then be printed and grow living fungi and other microbiomes. So that's kind of what I'm doing within CTSA in Jesse Jackson's lab. But looking kind of farther across the campus, I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Peter Bowler from the Eco-Evo biology department. Thanks to Jesse again. He's one of those people who knows everybody on campus, and he's been a wonderful mentor, introducing me to really, really wonderful individuals. But Dr. Peter Bowler runs the UCI Arboretum, which is currently undergoing changes as part of the North Campus redevelopment plan. And it was brought to my attention kind of in a long, non-direct way. So I was first offered several downed redwood trees from the Arboretum because I am a sculptor, and because I'm interested in making living objects. Wood is a perfect substrate for mushrooms and fungi. So I was offered these downed redwood trees at the Arboretum. And then it turned into, it seems like you really like plants. Did you know that, half of the Arboretum is unfortunately going to be removed for this redevelopment? I had no idea, but I took it as an opportunity to, try to do some kind of community and outdoor engagement, even in the midst of a really intense year in the pandemic. Being outside is a good place to be masked up and far away from people. So I took that as an opportunity to bring some of the community in really solo appointments to experience the Arboretum, to dig their own plants. And this project slowly became what I'm calling floritarian relief, which to me is kind of radical plant conservation. A lot of these plants wouldn't have been saved. And so it's been a real pleasure to see them go off to good homes, and plants are really good for us and our psyches as we navigate a really tough period of time. And I'm moving forward with making thesis pieces from some of the living artifacts that I've pulled from the space. This means I'm taking some of the root systems that maybe their primary plant has been taken to a new home where it can be rerouted. And I'm taking some of these kind of surviving artifacts, and I'm thinking about ways I can make living sculptures with those, hopefully to be shown eventually in my thesis exhibition. Yeah. Right.
We should let people know that the thesis exhibition is the culminating project of M.F.A, a Master in Fine Arts degree here, which can take a really wide variety of forms. Obviously, in the art department, it takes the form of generally an artwork or a series of artworks or a group of works that will be shown. one of the things I love about your project is that whereas in general in the art world, one's concerned about over time the deterioration of artworks. In your case, the artworks are going to be growing over time, taking forms that only biosci can give us insights into. It's really a wonderful idea. What have you actually done with these trees, the wood? I assume you've reduced them down to usable size in order to do your projects on.
Right. Okay. So I have a very manual labor focused sculpture practice. I don't like to ask for help. I like to do things on my own with, hand tools if I can. And working with these redwood trees from the Arboretum has been no different. They are particularly ornery for good reason. They were grown from cloned tissue cultures from Northern California and brought here to be grown in Southern California, which is not their native habitat. They have a lot of branches and knots, and therefore it's taken some time. I have learned how to swing an axe pretty effectively and a sledgehammer. And I break them down into kind of shorter planes that I can squirrel back to my studio. And then I've been using plane tools to take very thin strips off of the wood. I am a weaver on top of loving working in the wood and metal shops. I also work with really soft materials and fibers. So I've been actually taking these thin strips and weaving them on a wall loom so that they have their edges curling out and folding into one another. And the goal is to actually embed these weavings with substrate material that has spores from mycelium and fungi in them. So I am aiming to make some living weavings for my thesis show. That part is still in production because, as you might imagine, weaving with very thin strips of wood takes a long time. I have the living mushroom cultures in my studio, and I have the wood, and I'm just working slowly but surely away at that project here.
Have you found that your work has been significantly negatively affected by the pandemic? It sounds as though you've been able to continue pretty much with the kinds of things you've wanted to do in your studio during this time.
It was a learning curve. It certainly was. We were coming, my cohort and I had just finished our big second year exhibition. It's how we're judged for matriculation into our thesis year. And so we were all feeling kind of really up and excited to jump back in the studio. And then COVID-19 came along. So it was definitely an adjustment period. Suddenly my living room in my apartment was my studio, and weaving was one of the main things I could do. So I was weaving and reading a lot and actually furthering my interest in fungal dyes. You can make natural dyes from fungi. And I was going out and actually foraging because that seemed like a safe activity. So I was learning a lot and weaving to keep my hands moving through my artistic process. But I certainly pivoted my thesis as a result of that weaving experience. I was planning to have something much more sculpturally built out, I'd say, with non-natural materials for my thesis, but I shifted more to this like biodegradable practice, essentially, like you mentioned. I realized there was a lot of physical waste created from my last thesis or my last exhibition, and I wanted to experiment with the idea of ephemeral work that will not be around in the future, that'll break itself down on its own. So it was a good change, I would say, the pandemic shift.
Works in which the natural processes that happen over the course of time will simply be part of the projection that your work is going to go through during its life, its literal life, in other words.
Correct. Yep. Especially with the 3D printing projects that I'm hoping to kind of delve into, because a lot of the plastic now can be reclaimed from previous 3D printing projects. And if there were some kind of fungal relationship there where it broke down the object in question, we could have a sustainable object that would actually compost or degrade back to the earth. Mhm.
Sounds to me like this is just a really interesting project. Well, many aspects of what you're doing sound fascinating, but that sounds like a really wonderful project ongoing. Do you have any plans? This is probably going to give you a moment's fright, but you're very near the end of your time. You're working on your thesis project. Is any of what you're suggesting with regard to this new interest, really newly focused interest on this notion of biodegradable living tissue kind of thing out into your future? What do you intend to be doing after you're finished at UCI?
That is a good question, and yes, it is coming up. That's okay. Change is good, and I'm ready for it. But you know, part of my experience at UCI has been getting a lot of great experience teaching and being both a TA, and now this is my second quarter being a professor of my own class. And I was lucky enough to get to build the class from the ground up. So I got to develop a speculative design class. And that is really closely linked to these things that I'm working through with my own practice. 3D bioprinting is a very speculative kind of topic right now, but it's something that can actually come to fruition in the near future. So I do hope to continue that research after I graduate, but I also really love teaching. I want to be an artist researcher of sorts where I have my own research and artistic practice. But I also want to continue to teach. I was a member and I guess graduate of the Pedagogical Fellowship program here at UCI, and learned so many amazing lessons on how to be a facilitator of learning, especially with undergrads, that I want to continue that process moving forward as well. And I'm actually currently waiting to hear back from doctoral programs. I applied to several doctoral programs that combine, you know, art and technology, art and engineering, be that things like biomimicry and using living materials, kind of like I'm interested in, to make like medical devices, and combining weaving with coding and computer programming. I'm really interested in the kind of, you know, overlap that can provide a lot of wonderful inventions and ideas for the future. And it's a weird year to apply to PhD programs, but my fingers are crossed.
Well, it's the year that came up for you, so it's nothing that you engineered except by an accident of birth. So here you are in the midst of that process. I'm sure that it'll go exactly the way you want it to. Interestingly enough, what you're going to be doing, and I'm sure it's going to be working out for you, what you're going to be doing is not that far from the early plans for something in marine biology. You've just really sort of brought it onto the land. You've replicated the entire ontogeny of the bio world. It's really interesting. I'm really fascinated and really, of course, greatly admiring of your found interest in teaching. You've done so much of it, both in terms of pedagogical training here at UCI and also now in terms of implementation. Tell us something more about the class that you're now in the second week of here in the winter term. What are you teaching? What kind of students do you have? What has happened as a result of the COVID situation? Just tell us a little more about the class you're now involved in.
Right. So Antoinette and Jesse from my department asked me to develop a speculative design course that I actually first taught last fall. And as a result of it being kind of everyone's first planned online quarter of learning, I was trying to figure out ways that while I'm teaching this class, how can I get the students to have their own personal interest in it? Whether they are required to be there or they're interested in the topic, I wanted them to have their own buy-in for the class. And speculative design really focuses on looking at not only the present, but also the past to design for a future that, while it cannot immediately be realized, perhaps, we can plausibly see these ideas being brought into existence in the near future. So that seemed like a perfect way to talk to students who are in undergrad, which is already a hard and trying experience, and trying to figure out their own upcoming futures. And I wanted to get them excited about the future in the midst of what was a really tough year. And now moving into this quarter and teaching it again, there are still a lot of uncertainties. So the same kind of process of, teaching my students who come from all different parts of campus. I have a lot of art majors and digital arts minors, but I also have students coming to me from game design and the business school and marketing. And having that different kind of makeup of majors in the class provides a lot of really interesting perspectives. And as a result, the final projects that my students developed last quarter were absolutely amazing. A lot of students who had never engaged in critique before got to engage in that process of peer review of their artwork. But another kind of pillar of the class is this speculative design Zoom pod series that I have coined. Zoom pod meaning Zoom plus podcast, not unrelated to what we are doing right now. Where I actually wanted to show them potential career opportunities and real artwork and real jobs related to speculative design. I thought that would be a good way to get them excited about the potential opportunities they could take into the future if they decided to follow this path. So I interviewed some of our own alums from this school. I interviewed Miranda Javid and Ariel McLeese, who graduated several years ago from the M.F.A. art program, and some Hollywood professionals. We got into all different parts of the art world. So we talked to contemporary artists, filmmakers, animators, virtual effects people, all different types of professionals. So that has been another kind of pillar of the class. I'm mainly looking to the future while examining our current problems that we're going through and talking through those with the students. It's a very discussion-heavy class, and the students have been wonderful in the midst of hours of Zoom class, coming and being ready to talk and excited about it. So I've had a really positive experience so far with this class.
Well, I can tell just from listening to you talk about it, what a wonderful experience it is, and very excited to see what you do for your thesis show. And Ivy, I just want to thank you so much for coming and having a chat today. Look forward to seeing what you're going to be up to through the remainder of the spring and on into the future. Ivy Guile, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dean Barker. It was a pleasure.
And now we're going to be having a conversation with another of the graduate students in the art department, Gosia Wojas, who is doing really unique and interesting work that I know you're going to be fascinated by. So, Gosia, welcome. Great to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you.
Gosia is a part, as I say, of the grad student population in the art department. Her background is really quite remarkable. I shouldn't say her, I should say your background is really quite remarkable. And so I want to begin by showing the kind of really wonderful catchment that our art department actually achieves. And have you say something, Gosia, about your background. I know you're originally from Poland, but Poland is only the beginning of your amazing world experience. So tell us something about what you were up to before you came to UCI.
A lot. Yeah, I left Poland in 1996 when I was 19, and I first came to United States. I lived in Connecticut for about a year and a half. I took English classes. It was back then, the TOEFL exams were handwritten. So I then had opportunity to go to Singapore for a couple of years and had the experience of traveling around Southeast Asia and China. This was also quite remarkable time where you could still visit old Chinese buildings, the hudongs in Beijing, and when Beijing still had blue skies. I came to Los Angeles in 2000. So I wanted to apply to school. I hadn't decided which school and what degree I wanted to apply for yet. But at the same time, I needed to support myself. I was living in Los Angeles by myself. So I started to look for work, and I worked at many different places, but eventually decided that I do want to have a relationship with the art world and the art scene of Los Angeles. So I faxed my resume to I think almost every gallery in Los Angeles, and I got one reply after a couple of weeks from Suzanne Vielmette, who was a then very young German gallerist. She had just opened a few years earlier. And I worked with her for 5 years. I was a director for 3 years at that time. Yeah, that was, I think, probably the most formative time that I had professionally in the arts, and not just Los Angeles. I mean, that time in the gallery was quite successful, and it developed quite quickly. It was also an opening to the sort of international scene, art scene, with international relationships with museum curators and directors and collectors and many artists. Yeah, and after that I had my first child, so I decided to leave the gallery and focus on family life. But couldn't leave the art world and art and my sort of interests and working with artists behind. So I worked as a, I could say, independent curator. I organized a few projects and started a few projects. One of them publication project and discussion, kind of a conversation project with artists. And then I had another child, and then decided that before my life ends, I really do need to focus on completing what I've wanted to complete, and that was going back to school.
So before we get to school, let me take you back a step and ask you, your move from Poland to the United States when you came to the East Coast, was it art related? Were you doing art at that time already?
I was doing photography mostly, but mostly I was concentrating on trying to learn English. You know, when I came, I had a very thick Polish accent, and in school I had also studied British English, so I had the British accent with the Polish accent, and I could not understand CNN. I thought that was a different language to me altogether. And so I watched a lot of talk shows, the 90s talk shows. They were all really bad, but it was the only English that I could understand because it was just so basic. So that was that's what I mainly focused on, is trying to learn the language. And
sure. And then the amazing, you know, we don't think of Los Angeles as flyover country. We think of that as the Midwest. And yet you did a flyover going from the East Coast of the United States to Singapore and Southeast Asia. Was that art related as well? Or did that have to do with some other element in your life?
Yes, it was. My then partner got an amazing job offer to run a regional office for Southeast Asia for Standard & Poor's. And we were both very young, of course, so that was an amazing opportunity. It was all paid for, and we decided why not. So yeah, it was very, within a few years I was going from the very different reality of what was happening in Poland at that time, 96. It was just right after 1989.
Right.
Berlin Wall. It was a huge transformation. It was quite chaotic, actually, politically and economically in Poland. And it was the first time that the borders have opened up really for everybody. And so I went from that to this very suburban Connecticut little town, taking English classes at community college and with other non-native speakers from all over the world as well. And almost immediately going to Singapore in Southeast Asia in the 90s. It was a completely different world. To what it is even today, but yes, stark contrast from one to another. But it was an amazing experience. I actually fell in love with the Southeast Asian cultures, and so I decided I wanted to invest my time and effort while I'm there. So I began taking classes in Mandarin Chinese. My teacher, I can't remember her name, but I do know she was from Xi'an in China. It was, quite an amazing experience.
Absolutely. And then when you came back to the United States, to LA, and really essentially had a very successful professional career working in galleries, et cetera. So where you left off before I interrupted you, you said then in order to complete a kind of portfolio of what you considered to be your desired life, you felt that you needed to go back to school. You didn't come directly to UCI, however. You had an experience at CalArts. Was there, which is obviously a legendary place.
Mm-hmm.
What was it specifically about CalArts that took you there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question, because I have applied to many different programs, and to my surprise, I got into all of them, and I didn't realize that how different they actually all were, and how different of an experience I would have had in all of them. But I also had to think about where I was in my life. I was a little bit older, and I was not fitting quite older than the undergraduate age. So I felt that CalArts, because of its integration of graduate classes with undergraduate, it was a place that fit, that I would fit in better, I think. I thought, and I did, but there were, of course, a lot of different and kind of funny moments where I was mistaken for a faculty quite a lot of times. But it was, I think, a very good decision because of that, because I could take graduate level classes in my undergraduate program.
Yeah. Well, and one of the wonderful, actually lucky chances, both for you and for us, was that doing that experience at CalArts is actually just about perfect preparation for coming to the M.F.A. program at UCI, not only because of the way in which a number of our faculty have gone that route, but also because of the kinds of mix of the intellectual and the aesthetic of art and critical theory, et cetera, that is so popular and so important at CalArts, which is also very important here. Nonetheless, was that a part of what caused you to come to UCI? I'm specifically from CalArts to UCI.
It was exactly that. It was this relationship that the arts department at UCI has with the humanities department. And it was, I was very early on in my conversations with the chair department, Simon Long, talking about these different opportunities that I could have and possibilities for engaging with faculty at the humanities department here at UCI, and also developing another degree emphasis, which was quite unique, I thought. So I could have opportunity to engage fully with my department, but then also sort of dip in for research needs with the humanities department. So I, in the end, decided that this was quite important, since research was is an important factor in my practice. And so at the moment, I'm in the critical theory emphasis workshop, which is a year-long workshop, and is navigated with with 3 different faculties from the humanities, from the critical theory department, and yeah, it's very, I find that engagement with the department very valuable.
Right. It's a unique program. Obviously, UCI, the School of Humanities and the English and Comparative Literature program, philosophy program, and the relationship to a number of other schools around the campus with regard to critical theory and its history at UCI really is a huge magnet for top faculty and students from around the country. So I've always been delighted by our best students who understand the value of spending time in the critical theory emphasis in the School of Humanities. So I'm delighted that you're doing that. And it leads me to open up a topic with you, which I'm very interested in pursuing, and that is the relationship between your intellectual life and your creative life. One of the things that we're doing in all 4 of the departments in the School of the Arts is to really begin thinking more and more deeply about what research in the arts actually consists of. And it's not widely known nor widely even accepted that the arts are all about research. My case has always been that the arts are literally all about research into the nature of human experience, the nature of the depths of the human psyche and physiology. It's a fundamental area of what we do, and that there really isn't a creative endeavor that isn't about research. And yet, I know that what you've done with regard to your own work and your relationship to the critical theory emphasis in humanities is much more specific than those general ideas that I'm laying out. So say something about the way in which the work that you are doing and have done in critical theory is actually related to your own research as an artist here in the School of the Arts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I do want to point out that research in arts is something that is fundamental, but oftentimes not taught in schools enough, or not at all. So oftentimes artists have to find a way on their own to kind of narrow down or explore different options for the research that they want to pursue, and then narrow down. And oftentimes there's so much to learn and so many different avenues you can take, that narrowing down those, I feel, is the development of one's artistic practice. And so I'm slowly entering that stage. At CalArts, I started part of my ongoing research, which was looking at subject formation, and of course subject formation through many different theoretical branches of psychoanalysis, French feminism, starting the post-structuralists, and Western philosophy, starting with Kant. I took an amazing class with Catherine Malibu last spring on Kant, and that was the first time that I actually understood on the surface what Kant's philosophy was about. She's a French philosopher, as you know, and she's studied under Derrida. She has a great understanding of Western philosophy. But I was also, I'm still very much interested in post-colonial theories and decolonial theories on subject formation that take me into this exploration of very particular topics, and that is of this space, this sort of space between subject and object. So in a subject formation, there has to be there has to be interrogation of the object as much as the subject. And so I have found myself locked in that space for quite some time. And it's been quite fascinating because I feel that I'm being pulled in both directions. And of course, now I have just realizing now that we are living in such unprecedented times that space between the subject and object, which for centuries we thought was perhaps bigger, and we wanted to stretch out so that there is clear delineation between the subject and the object. Now it's almost non-existent, that there's almost no gap, right? We are, as humans, one with technology. We are living in Anthropocene, and so that interrogation of that space between the subject and the object is, I think, vital to understanding how humanity can move forward from this point on.
Absolutely, and actually, I would even take a step further and say one of the things that has happened throughout the course of 20th century and early 21st century philosophy and theory has to do with the fact that in some respect, the object is within the subject. Yes. And so there isn't even just a close relationship. There's actually an entanglement. Which makes the practice of the artist much more complex and much more interesting, in the sense that that old distinction, between the objective, the placid exterior, the external object that really doesn't need a viewer, doesn't need interaction from any exterior source, and the subject, which is well defined by skin, but also by a kind of bubble of the consciousness. Mm-hmm. This is an ancient model now, which is just no longer adhered to. And so the opening up through the course of gender studies, through the opening up of all kinds of new offshoots from critical theory, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, has so radically changed the relationship of subject and object. It's probably the most important topic that is really at work in the academy today. And yet, those are abstractions in the end. They're things we study. So with regard to you as an artist, how do you, Gosha, how do you bring those abstractions of subject, object, their relationships, etc., into your actual practice? How do you actually then explore and find results from the research that you're doing into that interesting and very complex subject-object dichotomy, which is increasingly less and less of a dichotomy?
Exactly. Yes, that's an excellent question. It is an ongoing question. It is an ongoing exploration of these ideas that one day seem very clear, another day seem very problematic, and you always go sort of one step forward and then two steps back. So we're like, wait a minute, I thought I had it, and all of a sudden I came to realize that I had nothing. But I think that it's important to me to be very much invested in this investigation of the material itself, and through the material, finding somehow a way to connect the ideas of resistance and activation and agency, and so that the practice of being engaged with material to me is quite important. When I was doing my curatorial projects, I started thinking about this quite intensely, and the publication that I have been working on and I hope to continue with starts with this sort of deconstruction of English word materiality. And so if you break down materiality into material I-T-Y and translate it into Polish, it means material and you.
Ah.
So I know you like it because it just makes sense.
It does indeed. Yes, indeed. Of course, that puts you in the object position,
yeah,
as opposed to material and me, for example, which would put material in relationship to the subject position. But that's just such a wonderful connection. So materiality as a topic, but what does that mean in terms of the media in which you're working? What materials do you actually use?
I used an array of materials, but at CalArts, when I was having my mid-res exhibition, one of the faculty professors was making references of my artworks to arte povera. I was using a lot of materials that were very much sort of older, forgotten basic materials like burlap and metal and hay. So I was interested in those kind of very basic, almost forgotten materials, almost invisible materials that we don't really think much about, especially hay. And hay has a very specific, very emotional value to me because of personal experiences of my family. My mother slept on a hay mattress when she was a child in post-war Poland. So I am interested in the sort of symbolic potentials that materials can also evoke, and those potentials they can have that have relationship to someone's agency or someone's, and of course, kind of notions of activation or resistance.
Right, that's fascinating because the materials you mentioned, burlap and hay and metals of various kinds, these are really almost archival materials now. They're materials that are related to a kind of cultural memory, and you relate directly to that with regard to your mother on her hay mattress in post-war Poland. But even in the United States, the notion of hay, from the great Midwestern plains and the history of all of that rural agricultural tradition, which is so largely just a question of nostalgia at this point, and burlap, which has its very many associations across the American South, for example, which is very problematic, but also very interesting. These are really evocative materials. So I do have to ask you, these archival material entities that you're working with, do they work their way into your theoretical framework for the way in which you're approaching your work? Do you see them as archival? Do you see yourself as, in terms of object and subject, for example, exploring memory, exploring identity in a different way? How do they actually match up for you?
I think I'm still working that out. I think it's a relationship that it takes time to develop with the material, and sometimes when I decide to work with material and continue through the research, sometimes it doesn't add up, and I have to leave it aside. I have to take some distance from it and move on to something else, another material. I also have, I'm also thinking of going back to working again with asphalt. I was doing asphalt paintings and at CalArts, and that is something that has been on my mind. Asphalt is also a very specific material that is not taken into consideration most of the time,
Right.
especially in it's kind of aesthetic, as an aesthetic quality. Yeah, but I am also now working on a much different material that has to do with self-learning systems, artificial intelligence, and a particular object that is, to me, amalgamation of subject and object in one. And that is a AI doll that is produced for a commercial market. So the materials have evolved in my practice, but I still very much think about all of them in as components of ongoing investigation, of ongoing practice.
Right. Well, the AI doll today will be the archival material of tomorrow, after all, given the rate at which technology is changing. So this brings me to really essentially my last question. And by the way, you'll notice that I'm avoiding asking you questions about COVID-19. I just don't want to get depressing. So I will say, as a last question, Gosha, with this amazing development through the archive of traditional materials you've worked with to this new emphasis on the AI doll, where do you see yourself going? What's the next step for you? What are you developing as you research into your future as an artist?
I don't know yet. I was thinking not even that long ago that I will be going into exploring PhD programs after I leave UCI. But at the same time, I still don't know where that would be. I'm very interested in what's happening in Poland right now, and I would like to connect and engage with my community in Poland on some level at some point. And I don't know whether that would be through exploring PhD programs there. It's difficult for me to say because I have children and family that would be, might be difficult to uproot and move to a different country where they don't really speak the language of. But I think my investment in research and working on these particular materials and developing them and sort of working them out for myself is something that I'm really invested in, and hope to continue to practice and give a shot at having a studio practice. I think I would like that after 20 years of doing all these different things. I think I would like to have the time to focus on studio practice and give it real attention.
Right. Well, I do feel as though, to be perfectly frank, that we've kind of caught you on one of the phases of a kind of gigantic odyssey, a trip out and a trip back. I see this trajectory of Poland to Connecticut to Singapore to LA to Irvine and potentially back to Poland as being one of the kind of great mythic journeys in your own life. Gosha, it's just been absolutely fantastic to explore some of your work with you. Thank you so much for bringing your intelligence and your creativity and your warmth and humanity to UCI and to the art department. We're just delighted that you've chosen to come and work with us here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was a joy. Thank you.